Hi everybody and welcome to month 2 of 12 months of metal. So just as a quick recap, last month we looked at how to cut out very basic shapes using a pair of jeweller's snips, tin snips, shears, let's say they go by various names, and how to clean up your edges using files, sandpaper and doing basic texturing using hammers. This month we're going to look at the cutting in a bit more depth, but we're going to be looking at how to cut out very intricate shapes using a jeweller's piercing saw. Jeweller's piercing saws come in two main types. You get fixed ones and you get adjustable ones that have the extra wing nut on the back. The point of the adjustable one is when you break your blade, you can take out the shorter broken section, adjust your saw, tighten it all up and carry on cutting. So this is a lot more economical in the long run. Some people find that they feel this slips over time and it becomes loose, but in my experience, the main wing nuts would slip way before this becomes loose. A jeweller's piercing saw is basically a fret saw, so generic DIY, and fret saws come in lots of different depths. You can compare the two. So the bigger the depth, the bigger a piece of metal you can cut before the back of the saw frame starts clacking into the metal and you can't get any further. But the bigger the frame, the considerably heavier it is, and because we use very fine blades, a heavy frame makes it easier to end up breaking your blades regularly. So these are the most popular depth of frame that you get. This is a standard jeweller's saw, and both of these ones they'd be considered budget saws, so nothing fancy. The budget piercing saws you can pick up for around £15 to £20 ish. You can get cheaper online if you shop around, but I found with the cheap ones where you're looking at about £8, these tend to not be very tight, they tend to slip, they tend to wear down very easily. So a jeweller's saw frame is one of the things I would recommend getting from a trusted supplier, unless you're lucky like me and I've got a couple of vintage ones from the second-hand tool shop that we talked about in month 1. So I absolutely love my vintage saw frame, but can you see it is shallower than the budget ones? So that means if I'm cutting anything big, this part would end up limiting me and I would have to sometimes take my blade out and come in from the other side because this could end up hitting against my metal. These are perfect for the majority of jobs. Now, although this size of saw frame is fairly common, you do get them with lots of different ways of attaching the blade. So one of the most common ways are these, I call them wing nuts, I don't know, they've probably got a proper name, but little things that you turn to tighten these washers together to grip onto the blade. But you can also get them with, use my other hand so you can see, levers. Or you can get them with almost like screws, but I don't particularly like those ones because to tighten them properly you quite often end up having to use a screwdriver or something similar, which is an extra thing that you've got to have on you. You can also get all these really expensive saw frames now, so things like New Concept and Green Lion, and everybody swears by them. I've put my hands up, I've never used one, and I don't know, but I do believe that if you learn how to cut properly, you should be able to cut with ease using a budget model. You don't need to spend a fortune on a saw frame to be able to cut out. If you are finding it difficult to hold your saw frame, there are things that you can do. So for example, this one, you can see this very jazzy thing attached to it. This is called polymorph or friendly plastic, or it does go under different trade names, but basically it's a morphable plastic. So if you heat the plastic up slightly, it becomes soft and squidgy and you can grip it, and then the handle will perfectly form to your particular grip. So the reason I have this is because I get a lot of students who have dexterity issues in their hands. So by making the handle bigger and by forming it to their personal grip, it just makes it a lot easier for them to hold on to. So it's a really quick, easy way of potentially making things a little bit easier, but most people would just use the handle that it came with. I'm also going to talk to you further down the line of other things that you can get to make your sewing easier if you do have dexterity problems in your hands. As well as your jeweller's saw frame, you're going to need some jewellery saw blades. Now these come in different sizes, so the chunkier the blade, the bigger the teeth, the thicker a piece of metal that you can cut with it. And the way they differentiate the blades is by numbers. And in theory, the higher the number, the thicker the blade. But where it gets a little bit confusing, jeweler's saw blades, the ones we tend to use for most things, are actually so fine that we're working in negative numbers. So for example, if a really coarse blade was a number 8, it would go down to 7, a little bit finer, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, quite fine. But then when we hit 1, we start going into negative numbers, which is what we tend to use. So it would then go 1/0. So a 1/0 is 1 less than 0. So therefore 1/0 is finer than a number 1. If you're not quite sure, there's lots of free resources online. So for example, this is a little resource chart from Art Jewellery magazine. I'm going to try and tag them in here, where it lists the different sizes of blades, and then it lists the thickness of metal that ideally you would be using to cut those blades with, and the size of drill bit you would need, the minimum size of drill bit, to be able to thread the blade through. So as I say, this one is from Art Jewellery magazine. Andrew Berry does one, Gano Skin. A lot of online tutorial and support websites have their own version that you can access and download for your own reference. So I have one that I keep in my studio for my own personal reference in case I'm doing anything other than the sort of work that I would normally do, and I want to figure out the best size saw blade for the piece of metal that I'm cutting out. So in most jewellery books and tutorials online, they recommend using a 2/0. So remember, negative numbers, so a 2/0 is, you know, finer than a number 1 blade. But for me, these are quite chunky still. The plus side is they're harder to break, but the downside is it makes it a little bit harder to get really delicate details out. So I prefer using a 4/0 or a 6/0, so even finer again because it's the negative numbers. When you buy blades, they become wrapped in a little bundle, normally about 12. There's normally a little bit of steel or brass wire holding them together, which you can unwrap, or you can try and pull one out while they're still wrapped together. And if I pull 2 of these out, and I'm going to take a close-up picture so you can actually see the difference in the size of the blade. Okay, so hopefully you can see here that the blade at the front, this little one, is coarser than the blade at the back. The teeth are bigger on the front one than they are on the blade at the back. Now, the blade at the front is a number 2/0. The blade at the back is a number 4/0. So the 4/0 is 2 grades finer than the 2. And you can see there is quite a big difference between them. And like I say, I much prefer cutting with the finer blade, and I would use a number 4/0 to do pretty much everything from 0.5mm thick all the way up to 1mm thick. But in theory, the thicker the metal, the more likely you are to use a coarser blade. As you can hopefully see from that close-up, if you've only got 1 or 2 sizes of blade, and there's a couple of sizes between the ones that you've got, you should be able to tell visually which blade is which, hopefully. But if you've got a wider range of saw blades, or you struggle to see them, then you need some way of keeping track of which blade is which, because when they arrive, like I say, they don't tend to be marked with anything, so it's quite easy to forget what size they are. So one of the simplest ways is just to keep them in a bag or a plastic pocket or something, where you've actually written on there what it is, and make sure when if you've used some and you're putting them back to use at a later date, put them back in the same bag. Another popular way is to use little test tubes, and again you can mark them, and you can get really nice wooden and metal test tube holders, so if it's in your own studio at home and you're not having to move them around all the time, it's nice to display them and you can see exactly what you've got and where they are. If you remember when we were talking about the files, and I was saying that the cutting motion only happens with most files on the forward push, it's the same with the saw. So the teeth point in a particular direction, they don't point straight out, they point on an angle, and the angle of those teeth need to be pointing down towards the handle, right? Especially when you're working with fine blades, that can be really difficult to see. So there's a bit of a trick to making sure that your saw blade goes in your saw frame the right way around. The first thing that you can do is take your saw frame, pop the top of it in your bench peg, in the V of it, and then it's less likely to slip, and put the handle in your sternum, and then just gently hold the blade in line with the saw frame between those 2 wing nuts, as if you're about to put it into the saw frame. while you're holding the blade in that position, take your finger, starting at the top of the saw frame, so furthest away from you, gently run your finger along the length of the blade. If it's completely smooth, that'll be the back of the saw frame, and you need to and you need to turn it around. If when you go from the table towards you, you can feel it and it's catching on your skin, you're going against the teeth. So it means the teeth will be pointing away from you, which is wrong, so you would need to rotate the blade around. If you go from the table on the top of the saw frame towards you and it's tickly, it's not snagging, you're going in the direction of the teeth, so it means that the teeth are pointing down towards the handle, which is what we want. So one way that you can remember is if you're going towards you and it's tickly, tickle me. Yeah? So it should be tickly and not snagging. When you've got the blade pointing in the right direction, loosen the top wing nut, insert the blade between the washer and the wing nut and tighten it as tight as you possibly can. When you've done that, if I was to do the same on the other side and just pop the bottom of the blade in here and tighten it up, this blade is going to be really, really wibbly wobbly and no good for cutting. To be able to cut, you need to have a lovely tight blade. So to do that, what you do is top the saw in the V of your bench peg, handle in your sternum or your tummy or your armpit, whatever feels comfy, and push. And what you're doing is you're pushing your body weight onto the saw frame, which means you're contracting, you're squashing the saw frame. So these two wing nuts are now a bit closer together. While pushing, put the blade between the washer and the wing nut, tighten it up as tight as you can, take your weight off the blade. You know you've done it right if you can put your finger behind the blade, give it a twang, and you're looking for that really high-pitched ding, 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 ding. Your blade is too loose. Ooh, that's very loose. If instead of a high-pitched ting, you get a twang. So twang bad, twing good. So I'm going to tighten this up again. I'm pushing in, tight, tight, tight. Ting, 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 ting. Now sometimes if people are struggling to get it tight, it's because the blade is butting up against this little bit of metal that comes down here. But if you can see closely, this bit of metal is shorter than the handle, so the blade can lie along that top section and still be nice and straight and not get in your way. So nice ding, 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 ding. So coming back to the difference between the budget saw frames and these more premium ones that have come out in recent years. Like I said, I put my hands up, I've never ever used one, so until I try one I can't say for sure, but in terms of speaking to other makers and what I've read online, the only real difference I've found is they're supposed to help you get your blade nice and tight, right? But some of these saw frames are like £80 to £100, so considering it is fairly easy just by pushing to get your blade tight, I want people to feel that they can cut with a budget saw frame and can do it very successfully, and if they want to buy a premium one, it's through choice. I don't want people feeling that they have to buy a premium saw frame, because a lot of the feedback I see online is, if you want to be able to do it, you need to spend all this money. That's not the case. These frames are a little bit lighter and they're easier to tension, but other than that, so once you've got your saw frame and your saw blade, you need a little bit of metal. So I'm going to be working with 0.5mm thick metal again, same as last month. And this little bit of metal is a bit of copper that I'm going to be using. Now, once you've got your metal, you need to draw your design that you want to cut onto it, and there's a couple of different ways of going about that. So one of the things we discussed, I'm trying to find it, last month, is using a scribe. So I'm not sure where I put mine, I hardly ever use it. But if you remember, a scribe was just a very pointy, sharp bit of steel that you can use to draw in your metal. If you want to do it the traditional way, you can use a scribe, you can use a sharp nail, you can use a pair of dividers like I am, and you just score your design onto your metal. But I don't like doing it that way because it's very low contrast. It can be hard to see depending on the lighting. I much prefer using a pen and some masking tape. So if you remember back to last month, what we were doing was taking some masking tape, putting it on the surface of our metal, and then taking either freehand or taking a shape template. We place that on the metal, and draw the design that we wanted to cut. And if you remember, it was important to use something with a fine nib so that you get an accurate line compared to something quite chunky. But other than that, any, you know, pen, pencil, skinny Sharpie, anything like that will do. And the nice thing about the masking tape is it's not going to mark your metal, but you're going to have a really high contrast, easy to see line to follow. So if you are drawing anything from scratch, I would use the masking tape. If you already have a picture or you've printed out an image that you want to cut, then we need to apply it in a different way, and we're going to use double-sided sticky tape. So here I've got a couple of things that I pre-printed. So for example, online you can get a whole range of silhouettes and line art. Some of them are royalty free, some of them you can subscribe and either pay a small fee for one-off sheet of designs, or you can pay a monthly fee to access and download as many as you want. Or also you can get training sheets. So this one is from Metalsmith Essentials, and it's just a sheet of different lines and turns that you can download to practice your cutting skills, just to get confident with the blade. And again, I'll try and link to this in the post if I can. So what you want to do is, once you've got the thing that you want to cut out, cut a square or rectangle around it roughly. There's absolutely no point cutting out your shape exactly with a pair of scissors, because the blade is going to do a much better job of cutting the intricate detail than a pair of scissors could. And then you're going to stick your double-sided tape on the back. It's really important that you stick the double-sided on the back of your design. For some reason people keep sticking the tape over the top of it, and then obviously you can't see what it is you're trying to cut out. Once you've stuck the tape on the back, you need to get rid of all this excess sticky sticking out the edges, because if you don't do that, you're going to really struggle to get the back off of the double-sided sticky tape. But also when you're cutting, all the little bits of dust are going to get stuck to the tape, your hand's going to get stuck to the tape, so you need to get rid of all of it. The easiest way to do that, if I try and do it upside down, is to very slightly cut through your paper again, and then you know you're getting rid of all the tape right up to the edge. Once you've done that, fold it slightly and you should be able to flick the backing off, and then you've got a sticky shape ready to stick onto your metal. The reason I love using the double-sided sticky tape is it's really quick, it's really clean, it's well stuck on there, so it's not going to start flapping around when you start cutting it. It's really easy to remove, it's not going to leave much of any residue behind. A lot of people, I heard, they use things like Pritt stick and stuff like that to stick their papers down, which you know is fine if you want to do that, but I've never bothered trying it because I know the Pritt stick is going to leave a residue behind, whereas with this double-sided sticky it's nice and secure and it's not going to move. So that's all ready to cut now. Apart from, I just want to make sure it's nice and flat, the metal, because any curly corners might get in the way. This is nice and flat, but if it wasn't, you would take your rawhide mallet and your steel block and just give it a gentle tap to make sure the metal's as flat as it can be. Now I've got my saw, my blade and my piece of metal prepped with a design on it ready to cut. So I'm going to put my metal onto my bench peg, because that's what's going to support it while I'm doing the cutting. And because I'm right-handed, I'm going to sit slightly to the right. A lot of people are just taught to sit right in the middle, but if you sit right in the middle, when you're moving your arm up and down, quite often your elbow's hitting your leg and you can only do very shallow movements. If you sit slightly off to the opposite side of the hand you're using, when you move your arm up and down, you've got a full range of movements because the saw isn't going to be going into your lap. If you've used a normal DIY saw before, generally it's on an angle and you put your body weight behind it when you're pushing and sawing. With a jeweler's saw, it's the complete opposite. It needs to be straight up and down at all times, so this is parallel to the ceiling, and you do not push at all. If you find you're struggling to be delicate and not push, for whatever reason, if you stick your pinky out when you're sawing, it makes you be a little bit more ladylike and delicate. Just to be completely sexist. I think what it is, if I grip the saw handle, I can grip it quite hard and then I can push quite hard. As soon as I stick my pinky out, it's forcing me not to have a tight grip, and because I don't have a tight grip, I'm going to be way less inclined to start pushing and putting my body weight onto it. And as I say, we're going to cut straight up and down. The only time that I tip the saw blade is the first entry into the metal, because it's easier to tip slightly and push it upwards just a notch into the metal, and then as soon as the saw blade is in the metal, I'm going to straighten up, and I'm going to use a nice up-down motion without pushing. As well as not pushing with your sawing hand, it's as important to really support your work with your non-sawing hand. Now, when people are learning, what they tend to do is they tend to hold on to the edge of the metal, and then they're gripping on for dear life, and all the blood is going from their knuckles, and doing this, and they're feeling all tense, trying to support this bit of metal, stopping it from jiggling around, and then you go away at the end of the day with claw hand, and you can't straighten your fingers out because you've been doing that all day. You don't need to do that, right? All you need to do is very gently lay your fingers over your work. So I'm not pushing, I'm not putting in any effort. I've got, ideally even have your elbow up on the table so that you can just relax into it and you're nice and relaxed, and then you can cut safely. This is why we don't tip the blade. So I'm going to show you that in more detail in a little second. Right, so hopefully you'll be able to see better from this angle. If I lay my fingers gently across there, I've got full support of my metal. It's not jiggling around the place compared to if I try and hold it at the edge. Obviously the downside is the blade, my fingers are in front of the blade. Now these blades are so thin, you will be there for ages trying to chop your fingers off. But if you catch yourself with them, the teeth are slightly variegated, and it can mean that it ends up bleeding quite a lot. It's a bit like a nasty paper cut, and at the end of the day, you know, we're in a workshop, it is dusty, you don't want to catch yourself, as much as sometimes it doesn't even hurt that much, because there is always the chance of infection. So you need to be careful, but that's why we cut straight, because if you see, if I'm cutting straight, I know exactly where that blade is at all times. As soon as I tip, it feels like I'm nowhere near my fingers, but actually it is quite close. So straight up and down at all times. When you're cutting, if you're going in a straight line, you can use as much of the blade as possible. As soon as you need to turn, you turn the metal while the saw frame is working up and down. So this is where a lot of people struggle, and they break a lot of blades. This is the main part where people break blades, and the reason being is because here they stop, they turn the metal, and then they try and pull down. And what you've done there is you've stopped, you've twisted your blade, and you're trying to pull down on a twisted blade. Whereas if you can keep the saw moving up and down, even if it's tiny, tiny, tiny little movements, and turn, you can more or less spin on the spot, and the blade is still pointing forwards, so therefore it can still cut smoothly and easily. And then when you're back on a straight line, you can start using more of your blade again. So if you can think of it like a sewing machine needle, right? A sewing machine needle goes up and down at the same spot, and when you need to change direction, you move your material. It's the same idea. So my blade is my needle, it's going up and down, and when I need to turn direction, I'm turning the material while the blade is still going up and down on the same spot. I'm making sure my work is supported so it's not jiggling around too much. If it does jiggle, I'm repositioning my fingers so I've got more support. Every now and again I'm blowing the dust away. Small movements to turn sharp corners. Now depending on how fast this is moving, depends on how fast you can spin your metal. So if your saw is moving very slowly up and down, you need to turn your metal slowly. If your saw is moving quite fast, you can spin your metal quite fast. I'm holding it quite far back in the V of the bench peg, because the more wood you can have under your metal, the easier it is to support it. So it's a lot easier for me to support it here compared to holding it down here. And can you see this metal's jiggling around because I haven't got much support under it. The downside of that is it's quite easy to start cutting into the wood. I wouldn't worry about damaging your bench peg, but obviously if you're doing fine detail and you've cut into something thick like wood, it's going to make it very difficult for you to keep cutting and turning. So if you cut into your wood, you can always move the saw blade up and down and just pull back slightly and it should release itself from being stuck in the wood. Next I need to cut out the little ears. If you're cutting anything with fine detail, even though the blades are very thin, they still remove a certain amount of material. So it's always a good idea to cut things with small details a little bit bigger, if you can, because you can always use a needle file and file things back at the end, but if you've chopped something off, that's it gone. It's quite normal to end up with lots of birds without beaks and claws and things like that, because people have cut right on their line and they've ended up losing that detail. So I'm cutting a little bit bigger. The other thing is, if you do stop and twist and pull and you think, oh, I've twisted my blade, don't force it, let go of your metal, lift everything up slightly and it will right itself into the blade being straightforward position, and then you're ready to start cutting again. What tends to happen is people get about 2/3 of the way around their design, and that's when they start breaking their blades more often. Now, part of the reason for that is I think they get overexcited and think, oh yeah, I'm nearly finished. You stop concentrating as much. But another reason is, up until that point, up until 2/3 of the way around, your little shape was supported by all this metal. And then you get 2/3 of the way around and all of a sudden you've cut your shape away from the majority of that support system. So at this point, I'm going to get up on my fingertips a bit more and make sure that I'm supporting my shape as well as the main body of the metal. If you're worried about having your fingers in front of the blade, you can also have your fingers in a V shape behind the blade, so the blade is straight between that gap, and therefore your fingers are never in front. It's a little bit more awkward holding it, you're a bit more cramped, but it's easy to do with a little bit of practice. So just bear that in mind, like I say, if you're a little bit nervous or worried about cutting yourself. Right. It's very rare that I've had anyone nip themselves with the blade while cutting out, because like I say, it's so fine, and as long as you're not tipping, you know where the blade is compared to where your fingers are. What can happen though is, it doesn't matter how slowly or gentle you are, when the blade leaves the metal, so when you finish your cutting, it will always, push your foot back so you can see, oh, lunge forward. So you need to make sure at that point it's going to lunge into the wood and not into your finger. So here you go, I've got a little bunny. I'm going to take the paper off so you can see him properly. Now, no matter how good a job you do at cutting out, even with the thin blades, everything will look a little bit rough initially. Getting a bit closer so you can see. Because you end up with these little burrs around the outside on your cutting line. But if you remember back to last month, little nail file is quite good at removing them, or to be honest, if you just sand the top and bottom of your piece, that tends to be enough to get rid of those little burrs. So I'm just going to give them a quick buff with some sandpaper and then I'll show you again. This is a very smooth sandpaper. But that's been enough just to get rid of those little rough burrs. He's too small, I can't see him. Little rough burrs, and there's my little rabbit. Now, like I said, if you'd cut any of your detail bigger and you needed to file it back, throwing them on the floor, little needle files come in a whole range of sizes and shapes. So you would just pick the one that best fits into whatever nook and cranny it is that you're trying to file back. Files are to do with changing the shape of things if you need to change the shape. Sanding is to do with smoothing. So because I don't need to change the shape, I'm just going to give them another quick sand to smooth out the surface, to get rid of any little, scratchy, burry bits. And then he would now be ready for polishing or soldering that we're going to do further down the line. Basically whatever you're going to do with him to turn him into a little piece of jewellery. So just a quick recap. Now when you're sewing, there's only 3 things that are likely to go wrong. Either you're pushing with your saw and you are bowing your blade. Can you see this blade? And I push is bending. So if I was pushing and forcing like that, it's just going to snap because they're so thin. So nice up and down motion without pushing. If you struggle, stick your pinky out. The other thing that can go wrong is that your metal is jiggling around. So if you remember, you need to support your metal with as much wood underneath as you can, rather than doing that and going away with claw hand. If the metal's jumping around, it's going to make it difficult to saw. And then lastly, the main reason why people break blades is just struggling to do the turning while up and down motion, because it is a little bit like tapping your head and rubbing your belly. It takes a bit of getting used to and some coordination. So that's the initial introduction. I know it's a bit of a whirlwind tour, but have a go, see how you get on. If you comment, let me know what you find most difficult, what you find easiest, any tips and tricks that you have to help other people. If you know of a reason why the really expensive saw frames are really great, other than the fact they're a little bit lighter and maybe a little bit easier to tension the blade, let me know, because you know, I'm up for being converted. This sort of size I like cutting. You could go a little bit bigger, but people generally make the mistake of thinking they're going to cut something big because it's going to be easier, but actually the bigger the piece, the longer it's going to take you to do it. And the bigger and sweeping the shapes are, the more noticeable it will be if you go a little bit wibbly wobbly. So circles are by far the hardest thing to cut, because it's very obvious if you even go a fraction of a mil inside the line of your circle. Organic shapes are a lot easier. Some of the samples I've got at the folk house are so small they fit on the pinky of my finger, and I actually find those really easy because they're nice and quick to do. And also, the more changes in direction, it forces you to concentrate. When people go wobbly off the line, quite often it's because they lose concentration. So I know with my students, quite often they start off and they're doing quite well, and then they get really confident with it, and then they start talking to the person opposite them or next to them, and you can see as soon as they've done that, that's when they've gone a little bit wibbly wobbly. So just take your time, breathe. Where people get a bit frustrated is if you start breaking your blades, they then get more tense, and if you become tense, you're doing jerkier movements, and then you break more blades because you're being jerky with it, so therefore you become more tense, and it becomes this horrible cycle. So it's just breathe, relax, shoulders back, light touch, don't push. Later in the month I'm going to show you tips on how to cut multiple things at one time, especially if you're doing anything thicker, how to lubricate your blade to make it a little bit easier to cut with. And internal cuts, external cuts, different sizes. When you're cutting, like I say, stay small, don't go too big, but post, let me know how you get on. You can use the hashtag MakeItMonth2 to sort of share what you've been up to, or tag me at MakeItKimToday and show me what you've been cutting. I'd love to see your designs. But for now, that's it, and I hope you enjoy it. I hope it makes sense, and just shout if you want any specific tips to do with using a jeweler's saw, and I'll cover them later in the month. Thanks for now.